I'm Alan Wartes, and you're listening to Think Radio.
When we're talking about environmental problems, we're not talking about a knowledge problem. We're talking about a problem of political will.
That's Dr. John Hausdoerffer, Dean of the Western State Colorado University School of Environment and Sustainability. We were talking about his new book, Wildness, Relations of People and Place. That and much more on this episode of Think Radio.
Think Radio is supported by the Gunnison Country Times, Gunnison's locally owned hometown newspaper, and by the Western State Colorado University Office of Academic Affairs. Think Radio is also supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can become a Think Radio patron, visit alanwartesmedia.com. That's ALANWARTES media.com.
John, thanks for joining me.
Great to be here, Alan.
We should start by pointing out that you and I graduated from Western State College back when it was not Western State Colorado University yet, in 1996, in the same year.
That's
But you're considerably younger than I am.
Yes, and I always like to confuse the audience at Headwaters conferences where when you play the guitar and leave, and then I get up and I say we graduated the same year. It looks like I've been drinking from the fountain of youth or something. Right?
Exactly.
But you were geology and I was history.
Right.
Yes.
Right. And that's where I want to start in our conversation today,
Sure.
because, you know, you're becoming kind of a big deal in the world of environmental philosophy, in the world of activism. But not many people know who you are and where you come from, why you are who you are. Bring us up to speed. You were here as an undergrad in the mid-'90s. Tell us what you came here to do.
Well, that's very humbled by that statement. I'm not sure I agree, but thank you for your kind words. So I grew up in New Jersey, and I had an older brother. He's teaching here at Western. His name's Tyson, and he's kind of a visionary. He always has to chase a bigger idea than anyone else around him.
Who does that sound like? I think that runs in the family.
Well, and he just had a vision, with the local hero, Jay Prentice, on our ski team back in Pennsylvania. We're going to go to the Rockies, and they got an advertisement, ski and study at the top. And they came out here, and I visited him, I think, when I was about a sophomore in high school. Not sure if I even wanted to go to college. I was not a strong student in high school. I wasn't compelled by that experience. And, I just go out for a ski trip thinking it's going to be snowy in winter, and plane lands in Gunnison, and it is indeed snowy in winter, but he picks me up with bikes on the roof. Always a bigger idea, this guy. And we go biking in the snow down a trail called Free Fall at Hartman Rocks. And it's evening, and the sun's going down, and there's alpenglow on Carbon Peak. And I had this flash of a thought, I'm going to die here. And I didn't mean that I would die on the trail. I meant this is the place. This is the place that's going to shape me, and then I'm going to give my life to. I was so moved by that moment.
This place has done that to a lot of people.
It has. They call it the Gunnison Curse, right?
Yeah, that alpenglow on Carbon Peak takes you down.
Takes you away, as Art Goodtimes would say.
Right.
You find yourself leaving the place for maybe a better job or a better house, and you find yourself in a traffic jam thinking, I left the alpenglow of Carbon Peak for this? And so I feel very lucky to be here.
So you left after graduating with a degree in history.
Mm-hmm.
You left to do what?
I then became interested in philosophy. A professor, intellectual historian named Jim Stewart really sparked my interest in ideas. And so I went to a place called St. John's down in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And it was a college with no grades, no departments, no lecture halls. Every classroom was a seminar table. Every professor was just called a tutor of nothing, and instead of disciplines, they had great books from all areas that just dealt with the big questions, what is the world? Who are we? How are we to live? And I just embraced that process. And the campus is right up against the Santa Fe National Forest near the Pecos Wilderness, and I ended up doing a lot of solitary walking and decided at that point that the philosophies that most compelled me were philosophies of nature and solitude in nature. And so I was reading a lot of Wordsworth and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Henry David Thoreau, and really moved by the idea of sort of the humility that comes from solitude in nature, right? As Emerson says, when you're in the woods, quote, "I am nothing, I see all." You stop seeing the place in terms of what it does for you, and you start seeing the place for what it is, and you realize you're pretty small in that place. And in that humility, you actually start to see, I am nothing, I see all. And I was really moved by that experience and knew at that point that I wanted to dedicate my life to environmental philosophy, and I knew I had to return to Western somehow. I knew I had to get back to Gunnison. There was no philosophy department. At that point, they'd canceled it in the late 90s, and there was a burgeoning environmental studies program, but I didn't have any degrees in that. And so I ended up going to Fort Collins, with my new partner and wife, Karen Hausdoerffer, who's a local teacher and writer here. And in Fort Collins, I ran a nonprofit, or helped run a nonprofit that was a conservation corps for youth. And it was very humbling for me, because I had come from this very almost white privileged experience of wilderness in my Santa Fe work and in my Gunnison experience. And then I was leading groups of culturally diverse, low economic kids who've been in and out of the system.
So it sounds like in some ways you came from this heady environment of reading thick books with big words down to the rubber meets the road kind of application of what you'd been thinking about.
But even realizing that I needed to apply something different than what I was thinking about. For example, I'll never forget this kid, Aaron Varro. Maybe the smartest student I've ever met, but has never done a day of college. I don't remember if he finished high school. And we were out in Rocky Mountain National Park doing some trail work, and the conversations with him were so rich. And a family in matching fleece walked by, and he goes, "You understand that as a minority, my cheap labor for this family to hike is highly problematic. Why am I being used to create their playground?" And
there's a big idea.
There's a big idea, and that big idea is we're going to talk about later.
In this book. Yeah, we'll get there.
And we returned to town, and the next project I made sure was in Aaron's neighborhood, right? And to let Aaron lead it, and that put me on a very different kind of path, where it wasn't just about wilderness. It was about thinking about ideas of the wild that can engage all walks of life in all places.
Okay. Well, I look forward to getting to that very question in a moment. But let's finish out your background. Where did you go then?
I knew after a couple of years of that I did want to fulfill my dream of returning to Western. So I got my PhD. Washington State University's American Studies program with an emphasis in environment and culture. It was a cool program. It was a mix of history, literature, philosophy, political theory, and women's studies, all getting at environmental justice. Then I had my first tenure track job in Florida. I was there for a year. I developed an environmental humanities program for them, and a job opened at Western, and I just feel so lucky that they hired me. And so I've been here now about 15 years as a professor of environment and sustainability, and I also co-founded the philosophy department on my return. And so that's sort of a mixed position I have.
Right. So you essentially have taken that, what you called a burgeoning environmental program here, and turned it into something quite different.
Well, I'm certainly standing on the shoulders of giants, as they say, right? People like Steve Dunn, Shelley Reed, George Sibley, John Soule, Alan Stork, Jessica Young. They created the vision based on the president, Harry Peterson, and the president, Jay Hellman, asking them to create a vision and of using this place well. That is, our current president, Greg Salisbury, will sometimes say, if you had a blank map of Colorado right now and you got to decide where universities went, who would put one here? And I think his challenge to us at Western is that how can we in 5 years have the answer be, of course it's here? And that's what I think Jay Hellman and Harry Peterson were getting at, is that how do we have programs that fully optimize the learning laboratories of this place? I inherited that. I can't take full credit.
So of course it's here. Why?
Right. We look at a sort of suite of learning laboratories in this valley that you can only find here. right? One is the incredible ecological and geological diversity that probably drew you here.
Mm-hmm.
And you're looking at it from the depths of the Black Canyon through semi-desert sage up into subalpine forest all the way to 14,000 feet. The life zones, the climate zones, all within a 10-minute walk.
As a geologist, every different kind of rock and process you can think of.
Right.
Okay.
And geology professors come from all over the world to bring their students here, right?
Right.
And you got to be a geology major here, right? So there's that. And, we have faculty like Jonathan Coop who gets students out in the winter on snowshoes, measuring trees and monitoring ecosystems. And it's an incredible place for that. But then, it's also politically a good learning laboratory. Gunnison County is 82% public lands, right, with all the major public lands agencies and the whole suite of complicated issues in the West to deal with in terms of multi-use and natural resource extraction.
Exactly. Nothing boring about any of that.
Nothing boring, and they really look to our students. And then finally, within that category, we have, 140 nonprofits in a county of 17,000 people?
Yeah, and as Suzanne Huey likes to say that if all of those nonprofits had fully staffed boards, something like every sixth adult in the Gunnison Valley would be serving on a board, and probably more than one.
Suzanne would do that math.
Yeah.
I love that about her. And she's probably right, and it's a challenge to all of us because I suspect several people are on many boards.
Yeah.
And so it's a learning laboratory in that way that, students really feel needed by this valley in a way that you don't find elsewhere. Those nonprofits are stretched. So they're eager for interns, they're eager for our master's projects, and then I think the third kind of learning laboratory we have is this campus. We see this campus as a experimental site for what a sustainable city might look like. And so we're looking at, what can you grow with a 70-day growing season in our student organic farm, the Organics Guild, right? Run by Kate Clark. We're looking at to what extent does solar have a good return on investment. We're investigating developing a major solar farm on campus, et cetera, et cetera. And so we have 7 LEED certified buildings. And so we see this as a place to experiment with what does a sustainable city look like.
So it's way past just thinking at the 60,000 foot level about theory.
That's right.
You guys are into the nuts and bolts of how do we make this work.
Right. And yeah, that's right. And that's been part of the environment and sustainability tradition for 25 years now, student projects. The freshman year they come in, every freshman's required to complete a major environmental service project, but those projects are run by juniors in another class where they're working with stakeholders and public lands agencies and organizations to organize and manage those projects with the freshmen as their volunteers. Then those freshmen become juniors running projects. We've been doing that for a decade. And then when they're seniors, they're individually or in groups doing a 16-week-long major project. And if they go into our Master Environmental Management program in the second year, they have to do a 600-hour project for an organization anywhere in the world. And by 2035, we will have put about 1,000 of those projects out into the world. And so we're really looking at what's called praxis, which is the merging of theory and action. And to help students cultivate a kind of a livelihood based on their values out of that praxis.
All right. Well, I'm chomping at the bit to get to the part where we talk about Wildness. The book. But before we get there, I have one more announcement to make. I want you to make this announcement.
Okay.
There's something exciting happening with your program here at Western. Tell us about it.
Oh, thank you, Alan. This week it'll be announced that the Environment and Sustainability program will become a new school of environment and sustainability. And I think that really shows Western's commitment to aspirational ideas in general. Sometimes the story about Western gets too obsessed over this year's enrollment numbers. Is it up 20? Is it down 15? It's time to aspire. It's time to recognize that, we're in an extremely unique place, that only a certain kind of university can be here. So the administration is really investing in my colleagues and I, and allowing us to build a school of environment and sustainability that really the difference between a program and a school, in my view, is how we serve communities. And the school will offer, all of those kinds of student projects I was talking about, 1,600-hour projects by 2035 for organizations around the world. And already projects have been done in Kenya and Colombia and all over Gunnison. That's a higher level than what we were doing when we were just a program.
Right.
Yeah.
And so here we are. We've gone from you on a bike at the top of a run called Free Fall, wondering if you're going to actually still be alive when you get to the bottom.
So that I can later die here.
And now, yeah, right. And now you're the dean of this brand new school.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you.
Very exciting. Which brings us to Wildness.
Ah.
This is a book that I think in some ways demonstrates that this place and this process that you've been through has been for you a learning laboratory. I would say that a lot of, and I've known you for years, a lot of this process of developing into who you are, the leadership role that you play here, is reflected in this book. That is a collection of voices, but it's got a singular idea: wildness. Describe that to me.
Yeah, well, I have to give credit to my friend and co-editor Gavin Van Horn from the Center for Humans and Nature in Chicago, and that produced this book. And he came to me, and he said, "Look, I want to do a book called The Relative Wild." And it's about how wildness is a relative condition. Like, it's not the same everywhere. It's all relative. It's about how wildness is a relative. Like, the more than human world is our kin. The relative wild. Let's play with that. And I loved it. And so what he wanted from me, he was really connected with beautifully talented Midwestern literary voices, nature writers, and I was connected with a lot of environmental justice voices. In fact, 17 of the chapters in here are written by people who were part of the Headwaters Conference at some point. And I really wanted to bring in authors who don't just fight for sort of a wilderness area or think about, the incredible biodiversity of nature, but who understand that the ability to continue a good life in a place, socially and spiritually, is rooted in ecological health. And ecological health requires social justice.
And these are people like Vandana Shiva.
You got it. Vandana Shiva.
Winona LaDuke.
Devon Pena.
Enrique Salmon.
Smith. Enrique Salmon and Michael Howard. Incredible voices who are saying some very complicated things about wildness, and we can get into that. But I want to just start by responding to your question about the common thread. So when we shifted to just a bigger idea, let's just call it wildness, and we felt a little presumptuous, like, who are we to have the book called Wildness, And the University of Chicago Press encouraged us to give ourselves permission to do that and to claim that. And so really the consistent thread is twofold. One is that we find wildness everywhere, and there's a continuum of wildness from wilderness zoned landscape, which wilderness areas on public lands where you can't have industrial extraction or mechanized vehicles. So there's wildness there. But how do you also find it on a ranch? How do you co-create it on a ranch? How do you also find it on a farm? How do you also find it in the inner city? And the goal of
and do you not also have to deal with the question that has dominated environmental thought for a long time? Does it even exist anywhere but wilderness? Are these just fanciful concepts that don't actually exist in the real world? In order to get to the point where you're saying, how do you create it on a ranch? Didn't you have to get to that stage of giving yourself permission to say, well, it's possible to do that?
Well, yes. And the first thing we had to do was make a clear distinction between wilderness and wildness. Wilderness is vital and a vital and necessary form of zoning on public land for the sake of biodiversity and human solitude, right? Just like you don't want a McDonald's in your neighborhood, you want zoning. These 110 million acres of public lands are zoned for this. But wildness is a bigger idea. Wilderness is a form of zoning. Wildness is the capacity for self-renewal of any species, any being, any community, any system, anything that can renew itself without requiring the control of another is wild, right? And you find that in wilderness areas. When you reintroduce wolves into Yellowstone, you find right? That they, control elk populations and reduce soil erosion by not overgrazing. And so the place can self-renew because the wolves are there. So you find it there. That's
but when I lived in
wildness.
Denver, I also found it all along Coal Creek. If I was willing to get off of the bike path
Exactly.
and walk down toward the water, this is the idea that wildness is not limited.
Yeah, I'll add another layer to that. So, okay, you find that self-renewal in wilderness areas. The question of the book then becomes, where else do you find it?
Mm-hmm.
And so right off the bat, you just mentioned Denver. It just came to you right away.
Yeah, I lived there, and it was a mile from my house, and it was the place that I found to seek refuge. And I was typically the only one there, but it was there.
Let me just play off of that a little bit and kind of reflect back. When I was using the word wildness, you were going to wilderness in our conversation.
Mm-hmm.
When I shifted to capacity for self-renewal, you started using words like refuge, and you thought of a place.
Yeah.
That's we hope the power of this project is that we can shift people away from arguing over wilderness landscapes and move them into thinking about renewal everywhere. And it's not just the renewal of the plants where you would go walk in Denver. It's also your renewal because you got refuge there.
Now, that is a key idea in the book that I want to get to right away.
Okay.
The idea that humans are inseparable from this conversation. We don't think of wildness as over there because we are a part of it wherever it's to be found. Mm-hmm. My renewal is just as important as the renewal of the landscape. You said so, but my involvement with the landscape is an important part of this concept of wildness.
That's right. That's right. And I will say that a weakness of wilderness is it suggests a way. The Wilderness Act actually says, quote, land where, quote, man is a visitor who does not remain.
Well, it's hard to get there, usually.
Yeah, and it's a place of comfort for people of privilege. And we can talk about that today as well. But I want to get back to what you were just saying, and that is, yes, wildness. How did you put it?
You suggested that part of the equation is that I'm renewed when I go to these places.
That's right.
But there is clearly a need for the renewal of the landscape as well.
That's right.
In some places, and that my involvement in that is what, Enrique Salman in the book says, we have to think of ourselves as keystone species.
He does.
In these places, wherever they're found.
Yeah, and he's, Tarahumara Raramuri indigenous from Mexico, who's also a surfing, trumpet-playing anthropologist, grandpa teleskiing storyteller. Yes, and he says that in fact the biodiversity of that landscape that his people have inhabited perhaps since the beginning, the biodiversity of that landscape was co-created. Let me put it this way. The production of their livelihood resulted in more biodiversity. And so just like a beaver will make a dam and create habitat for other species, he says, we're keystone species in our place. And one of the things that's important about Enrique's essay is that he rejects the notion of wildness and wilderness. He says, his opening line, there is no word for wild in my language. And I think we all need to recognize that. Think about it. If your people, through intelligent decision-making, trial and error, getting it wrong, adjusting, teaching the next generation how to do it better, learning from the failures of the past, breaking cycles, finally result in a society that can produce biodiversity through producing your livelihood, and you're a keystone species, right? And that's your homeland with your intelligence written onto it. And then a society shows up and calls it wilderness. How
to even draw those lines?
How would that feel to have your intelligently produced homeland called a wilderness? And there's a kind of racism in the wilderness idea there, a wiping away, an erasure of that Native American intelligence. And so, I think that's really important to understand that from his point of view, it's a colonialist term. It makes that land available for theft once you can call it wilderness instead of someone's homeland.
Mm-hmm. Or, at the very least, it makes it vulnerable to someone else's idea of what ought to happen there.
Exactly. And the dominant ideology is then written onto that land.
Yeah.
The idea of nature's a stockroom of resources now gets written onto that land instead of humans are a keystone species being written onto that land.
Mm-hmm. Well, before we run the risk of making this about natives versus other people that we might call non-native. I don't even know how we got to that.
Yeah, right.
But the idea in the book is that it doesn't matter who you are or where you are. Wildness is present.
Well, I appreciate that. And let me give you a non-native
it's an awkward construction.
example. And it gets back to your question about renewal. How does the renewal of the ecosystem and connect with the renewal of the self? Wes Jackson, who used to direct the Land Institute in Kansas, he's restoring the ecosystem function of the prairie by creating biodiversity, diverse plant systems. But they're also perennial plants, and they're also edible, and they also provide biofuel. And so he's stabilizing the soil, right? He's sequestering carbon, he's creating habitat, while also creating a system that might be able to feed and fuel the masses. So let's think about this. That's the co-creation of wildness by restoring the function of the prairie and by restoring habitat. And the production of our livelihood, food and fuel, is creating biodiversity. But so you're renewing wildness on the land, but you're now also renewing the ability of people to stay in that place, right? Because the Ogallala Aquifer has 30 years left, but that system won't need it. Renewal, renewal, renewal. And now you're renewing people from the trauma of having to leave their place, or you're relieving them of that trauma and therefore allowing them to renew spiritually as well as socially, ecologically. And so for me, the book is about renewal.
And in what way do you think this idea of renewal where you are, full spectrum renewal, as you've described it, in what way is that a new and groundbreaking idea in the environmental movement?
In some ways it's not, right? The environmental movement is rooted in the idea of the sublime, going all the way back to, late 18th century France, with Rousseau going up into the mountains, going all the way through, Thoreau at Walden and John Muir on top of a sequoia tree in a lightning storm, screaming that he wants to drink sequoia blood. And so that sublime means a combination of fear and awe from being faced with the humbling power of nature, the sublime. And so I think, national parks all the way up through the Wilderness Act, 1964, all the way through to the REI culture of the outdoor industry. Renewal is nothing new when it comes to connection with nature. And I think what's new about this book, though, is the demand that connection with wildness be renewing for everybody. And if I may, I'd like to share a perspective from a woman named Mistinguett Smith. And she is the founder of the Black Land Project. And she interviews African Americans from all walks of life, urban, rural, low through upper income, north, south, east, west, and tremendous diversity, of course, like in any cultural community. But a common thread she's found is that a kind of cultural trauma, about what happened in the woods under slavery. Where were you punished? It was in the woods. Where did you try to escape through? It was the woods. Where was your ancestor hanged or lynched? It was in the woods. And
this is a traumatic association.
That's right. And in her interviews to this day, it will come up. And people will see a picture of a tree and say, and tell a story of an ancestor hanged from a tree. And so given that there's a deep history of renewal through wildness, through the sublime, how do we make that renewal equally possible for everybody, given that for some, an image of a tree is a trigger of trauma, whereas for others, an image of a tree is transformative?
What's your answer to that?
Well, I think part of the answer is a kind of humility from the white middle-class environmental movement, understanding that as important as wilderness acreage is for the sake of biodiversity in an age of climate disturbance, we need to learn how to find and fight for wildness everywhere through listening to and working with people who have inhabited and started to co-create unexpected places of wildness.
Well, and that would even include economically challenged white people around the country for whom the word sublime is not likely to enter their lexicon on any level, but yet this is still a very available and important concept where they live.
Yeah, there might be a family tradition of hunting, right? It's a deep connection, right? Talk about getting at the primalness of, will I eat tonight?
Right.
If I don't think enough like an elk, which requires me to know the land. You're wild at that point. Who am I to say what wild is when I've never hunted, right? People who have an identity, even if they're in a suburban area, they're driving a truck listening to country music, they're living out that narrative of an agricultural rural identity.
Sure.
That there's wildness from agricultural systems. Like I said, in the book, we have Joel Salatin and Courtney White. They talk about ranchers starting to bunch livestock together and move them around like wildlife, and that's enhancing grasslands.
Yeah, we have that here. With,
the Parkers.
Bill and Kelly Parker.
You bet. And with Suzanne Huey trying to create a savory hub, and I'll just say that gets back to renewal, Alan, because not only is that method renewing grasslands. It's, again, renewing the ability of a rancher to continue a way of life in that place.
So how did we ever get to the point where our agricultural heritage got sliced up and the notion of connection with nature was shipped off to places where, above 10,000 feet?
Rock and ice.
How did we ever do that? What happened to us?
Well, my first book was called Catlin's Lament. I try to answer that question in a way. George Catlin, 1830s. He was an artist. He's kind of like you, Alan, did it all. He was an artist. He was a performer. He was an essayist. He was a traveler. He made a decision to dedicate all of his talents to Native American communities in the face of their decline. And so he traveled west, lived with the Mandan when they were wiped out by smallpox, went all the way to the mouth of the Yellowstone River and had a moment. And he's sitting there and he imagines himself elevated above his body, almost an out-of-body experience, he writes about. And he's brought up to a 30,000-foot view, and he looks out from the Mississippi to the Rockies, from Canada to Mexico, and he sees prairie-based buffalo cultures of Native Americans following the buffalo, and the buffalo enriching the grasslands and flowing where the rain is going. So sky and land and grass and buffalo and people. And he says, what about a nation's park? There's no forest here. There's no mining here. We can't farm this. Well, he was wrong there until the Dust Bowl. But and he said, what about a nation's park? And my point here is that, I'll get to your question now, in that moment, we had the first idea of a national park, but for the sake of social justice, right?
Not as an escape from.
Exactly. When the first he failed, but when the first Yellowstone National Park was actually created 40 years later, the Bannock tribe was removed to make it look more like sublime nature. What happened in that 40 years? And we've never recovered from it. The movement had a chance with Catlin to be about environmentalism for the sake of social justice for people. And it split, and we went into a barrage of national parks that displaced Native peoples. We went into a wilderness idea in which, quote, man is a visitor who does not remain. And we went into a federal land regime that alienates rural people because they're scared of the federal government or government overreach, right? And so here we are.
ThinkRadio is supported by the Gunnison Country Times, Gunnison, Colorado's locally owned hometown newspaper. ThinkRadio is also supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can join the ThinkRadio community of patrons, visit alanwartesmedia.com. That's ALANWARTES media.com.
And so this book then,
Wildness,
yep, is a collective call to finally recover from that.
Let me talk about that a little bit, actually. Gavin's goal was to really show that continuum. He did this really artfully as an editor, to really show that continuum from wilderness down to urban and to show wildness present everywhere. My goal was a frustration about a division within environmentalism, that I saw kind of three corners. I saw the wilderness movement, highly successful, 110 million acres in its first century.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Can't argue with that.
Incredible. I'm not saying their work is done. I'm just saying because we have a species crisis. We need corridors between wilderness areas now and stuff, et cetera. But, okay, highly successful. A working landscape movement that's just really emerging now, right? Holistic ranching, sustainable food, farmers markets growing by like 20% a year, right? And then environmental justice movement. From United Farm Workers to Love Canal to Flint, Michigan this year, right? What if those three movements were united around a common idea? But instead what we've seen is division, right? So one of the essays in here by Laura Watt shows that in Point Reyes, California, Working Landscapes, a sustainable oyster farm, was displaced by a wilderness area. Or between wilderness and environmental justice, the United Farm Workers in the 60s, when they were trying to ban DDT, reached out to the Sierra Club and said, let's build solidarity. And Sierra Club said, we're sorry, that's not
what we do.
It's not what we do.
It's not in our mission statement.
Exactly. And so that triangle of wilderness, environmental justice, and working landscapes movements, I have that triangle, Gavin and I have that triangle brought together between these pages. Courtney White and Joel Salatin and Wes Jackson on Working Landscapes, or Devon Pena and Vandana Shiva on Environmental Justice, and then Rod Nash and Gary Snyder and Robert Michael Pyle on Wilderness, and so there they are in between the pages together. Mm-hmm. And if we can find a unifying idea, that is an unstoppable movement. Those three movements brought together on common cause is an unstoppable movement.
And you are hopeful?
I am a very hopeful person. Some may say naive, but I've seen a conversation form around, I think, both the climate and food movements that makes these divisions less likely. As horrific as climate change is, it also shows the need for solidarity. The ability of a privileged ski bum like me to continue a way of life in a place is suddenly connected with an Inuit person whose village is being removed. And, climate change is bringing together people who otherwise wouldn't see common cause. I think the food movement's doing that as well. People who care about climate change and want to reduce carbon emissions don't want food to travel 3,000 miles. People who care about workers' rights are worried about pesticides on workers. People who care about ecosystems are worried about pesticides on aquatic ecosystems and streams. As scary as the problem is, it's revealing interconnections. Mm-hmm. That weren't possible 20 years ago.
Let's try to bring someone else into that
Sure.
web that you just spun.
The web, yeah.
The web of the Inuit that cares about one thing and the ski bum that cares about another and so forth. Mm-hmm. What about the plumber, the inner city plumber who cares about paying his mortgage, who cares about getting his kids successfully through school without falling into any of the cultural pits that are out there that parents worry about? How is the idea of wildness relevant and useful to that segment of the population?
It's such an important question. And, I met a man in Kenya named Wilberforce, and he said, you cannot conserve on an empty stomach.
Correct.
This is what you're asking me.
Yes.
A couple of things. One is that I think everyone wants recharge in their life. And we have a new environmental psychologist here at Western named Salif Muhammad. And Salif's focus is on the cognitive health benefits of connection with nature, including things like ADHD, depression. And we're seeing white, lower and middle class, middle-aged suicides rising.
Correct.
Higher than teenagers right now.
Particularly among 40 to 60-year-old men.
Correct. I think we're starting to see scientific evidence that bringing wildness into urban spaces, allows for that kind of regeneration, renewal, and I think that's very important. But beyond that, it goes beyond just having wildness in your community in terms of
green space and so forth.
It's more about rediscovering the human role in co-creating that wildness. And so if urban working class resident is tired of the diabetes rate in their community or the obesity rate among their children or the screen time of their children, what would happen if one were to start growing food? At that point, right? There's a man named Ron Finley. He calls himself the guerrilla gardener. No, he calls himself the gangster gardener. He's in South Central LA.
Oh, I like that so much more.
Yeah, and he's in LA and in the medians. He's been making these gorgeous gardens, and the city tried to shut them down. He fought that. And
of course they did.
Bringing wildness to your place, but it's also awakening your own wildness by co-creating that wildness. And I think that kind of alienation from not just where your food comes from, but like your role in the production of your life. When you talk about the plumber, that's probably someone who also knows how to fix a car, and I can't. Probably knows someone who knows how to build a shed, et cetera, has a kind of skill set that many of us don't. What would it mean for that person to reskill, in a way that also co-create wildness and help with diet and help with regeneration? You look at some of these studies of prisons that have gotten gardens, right? And you see behavioral improvements and things of that nature.
Well, so that really provides an answer then to the follow-on question, which is, if the plumber says to himself, wow, this is a compelling idea, I think I need to get involved, there are things that ordinary people can do without traveling far, without investing a ton. Things like planting a little food. What else would you suggest to that person who comes to you and says, I'm in, what now?
Well, I guess I want to be really clear about one thing, is that we don't want to continue the history of the condescending professor telling people how to live. I have a lot to learn from that person, whether it's about a family narrative of how to hunt, I've already admitted that, or if it's a sort of skill set for just getting things done, knowing how to make a vision into a reality, physically from having a trade, which I don't have. I have an incredible amount to learn from that person.
So it sounds to me like you're talking about the necessity for community. This isn't a technique of doing things on the landscape. This is deeper than that. It's about humbling ourselves with each other and creating community connections.
It's about co-creative community renewal. Devon Pena has an essay in here. He's from San Luis, Colorado, so local voice. And he's talking about your working class community and how they've lived on the land and grown food indigenously and hunted and gathered indigenous plants and cut wood. And he says that community didn't notice the depression because A, the employment rate's still the same, and B, they've had a skill set for fueling their life connected to the land, right, that has been part of, I would call it entrepreneurship. They're entrepreneurial in that place.
Right. Their resource base didn't depend on Wall Street.
Yeah, there's social capital, there's natural capital. They don't only rely on financial capital. And I think you're right. And I think that, when you look at the story of places like San Luis, that's the skill set that we need to return to. When Vandana Shiva spoke at Western at Headwaters, and you were in the room, I believe you opened for her by playing the Headwaters anthem, which I won't make you sing today. She said, we need to learn to think with our hands. That's the community you just hit on. It's a community of think with your hands. What does that phrase even mean to you? We need to learn to think with our hands.
Well, it means to me that the projects that we undertake are ones that are to hand. They're the ones that actually exist in our physical environment. You can't put your hands on an idea, but you can put your hands on a community garden or a social justice initiative in your own community.
Yeah. Well, and I
love that idea.
That's the hand side of thinking with your hands. But then the think side of thinking with your hands is realizing that, yes, I wrote a book here with Gavin and other authors, but my ideas are not most written onto the page. Our ideas are written onto the land, right? So the idea that rain will follow the plow was written onto the plains landscape to the point that the Dust Bowl happened. That Dust Bowl is an expression of the failed idea that rain will follow the plow. So when she's saying we need to think with our hands, she's saying we need to make sure that the thoughts we have are the ones that actually work with our hands over time.
And who knows that better than the people who are already occupying the landscape?
Occupying the landscape and working with their hands.
Right.
Absolutely. And I think Gunnison's a unique place because there are ranchers like the Parkers and green builders like Dusty Smansky and people in the hands-driven economy. Joe Bob turning a junkyard into an art gallery, whatever you want to call it.
Into Joe Bobistan.
I haven't heard that one yet. That's incredible that we have folks like that. I had a beverage with Lizzie the Fiddler last night. You walk into a bar and there's someone who's making a way of a life in a place as a fiddler. And so it's a place in which people have figured out how with their hands to build a livelihood based on their values, which is the thought part. That's the thinking with your hands. How do you build a livelihood based on your values? And if my value is one of renewal, then we need this community of thinkers and doers. Right? And the thinkers need to be humbled in that.
Well, all of that sounds very hopeful. It really does. It sounds like something that's doable. I want to read to you, though, from something that was released just last month by the Union of Concerned Scientists.
It's not a hopeful time, Alan.
15,000 scientists around the world unified their voices to say, we're in deep trouble. This is a message that's out there as well. It's the dominant message these days. When people turn on the news, typically this is what they come across. An excerpt from that report. By failing to adequately limit population growth, reassess the role of an economy rooted in growth, reduce greenhouse gases, incentivize renewable energy, protect habitat, restore ecosystems, curb pollution, halt defaunation, and constrain invasive alien species, humanity is not taking the urgent steps needed to safeguard our imperiled biosphere. Now, when our plumber reads that, that list is so exhaustive that it's exhausting. How do you speak into that moment to say, it's okay, it's okay. Wildness is something that we can pursue. It's something that can renew not only the landscape, but communities and people. How do you compete with a full spectrum assault like that?
Well, first of all is to be honest, and to say that the scientific evidence backs that statement. Mm-hmm. And if this caricatured person we're talking about,
right,
expressed any, skepticism just because it seems so impossible, I'd point out that we're looking at 98% of scientists. Point is this: you visited 100 doctors with your child. 98 of those doctors said that your child had a terminal illness. You would act creatively, aggressively, and relentlessly to listen to those 98 doctors to save your child.
Mm-hmm.
And we're being told by 98 out of 100 scientists now that Earth, our home, has this terminal illness. And we are compelled to act. Not to screw around with, what about that 2%? Oh, well, this is urgent. So that would be my first thing, is just to recognize the seriousness of that. But I think there are two other things, Alan, that are maybe more hopeful. The first is that it's a great line from David Orr. He spoke here once. He's an educational environmental philosopher, and he said, when we're talking about environmental problems, we're not talking about a knowledge problem. We're talking about a problem of political will. For example, there's an architect, William McDonough, who designed a massive building in Michigan as a factory. And he thought to himself, well, what if a building fulfilled the function of a tree? All right, well, what do trees do? They provide habitat, they turn carbon dioxide into oxygen, they create their own energy, they purify water. Okay. And so, right, there's a living machine of like a wetland surrounding the building, so the water coming out is cleaner than the water going into this factory. Mm-hmm. There's a living roof that has attracted 300 different bird species. It also sequesters carbon, right? It produces its own energy through solar panels, et cetera, et cetera. And he says, imagine buildings like trees, cities like forests. We don't have a knowledge problem.
We can do this. It works.
That's the second point. My third response, and this is the last really point I have from the book, is that this is not a technical problem to fix. This is about our story that we're living out. Mm. And you're a storyteller.
Yeah.
Right? And the story we've, according to Daniel Ishmael, and I agree with him, the story we've been living out for 10,000 years is this one. God made the world for man, and man was made to rule it. And that story has led us to 70,000 Puerto Rican climate refugees being forced off their homeland. That story led to the Dust Bowl making the plains uninhabitable. We know God made the world for man, man was made to rule it. Does not work. Well, so what is the new story? And I think, Alan, to address this quote you read to me, we don't just need new kinds of solar panels and hybrid cars. We need a new story.
And that was Daniel Ishmael's key point.
Yes.
In that book, or Daniel
Quinn's Ishmael, yeah.
Daniel Quinn's key point in the book Ishmael was, that's really good news, because if it's only a story,
exactly,
then we can tell a new one.
Right. Instead of deciding we're a cancer on the planet, all we need is a new story, and we can design a new one. And so for me, I actually like to read a paragraph. That's the question, is how does wildness as renewal, ecological, social, spiritual renewal, how does that become our new story? And may I?
Please.
This is from Vandana Shiva, a philosopher from India, activist. There it is. And I want you to think about wildness as like the capacity for self-renewal and self-organizing beings or wild beings when you hear this. But also, what is our new story? When I talk about the infinite creative energy of the universe, I am talking about Gaia's self-organizing energy, but also the creative human energy to work and to produce, to organize and to transform. In India and around the world, this human energy has helped cultivate the self-organizing energy of the world. In particular, the creativity, innovation, and decision-making power of women, who still produce 80% of the world's food, has significantly driven the world's biodiversity. The majority of the 80,000 plant species that humans have cultivated have emerged from the self-organizing, living energies of women. In other words, if we're going to redefine wildness, we have to simultaneously redefine humans as co-creators of wealth with nature. That's our new story. It's not about the environmental rhetoric of smallness, shrink your carbon footprint, leave no trace, reduce, recycle. We're not a species that wants to be small. We're a species that wants to be great. We can be co-creators of wildness with nature, that keystone species again. We need a new story. And the Union of Concerned Scientists are sounding the alarm about the consequences, the symptoms of the old story. But it's not enough to address those symptoms. That's why I chose to be a philosopher instead of a policy person or engineer producing solar panels. I chose to be a philosopher because I thought the new story is what addresses the source of the symptoms, the disease.
And it's no coincidence, that right now, in addition to this great growing public awareness of environmental threat, that we're also struggling with some very deep and fundamental social justice kinds of issues.
That's right.
And your point is, those two things belong in the same conversation.
They do. Environmental exploitation is impossible without social inequalities. Forests the size of Europe were caught in North America in about 20 years in the 1800s. Would that have been possible without the racism that removed Indians from the land, the racism that forced black labor onto the land, and the gender inequalities that forced women into the factories to turn those trees into pencils and paper to sell around the world? Not possible to clear-cut forests the size of Europe without the racism and the patriarchy of that economy.
Well, let's tell a new story then.
Yeah, and it needs to be a story in which nature's not just a stockroom of resources, but sort of our home.
All right. Well, John, I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation.
Me too.
Thanks for joining me. Before we sign off, though, I want to give a shout out to the Center, because this book would not have been possible without them.
That's right. That's right.
So talk to us about what they do and how people can connect with their work.
Absolutely. The Center for Humans and Nature is out of Chicago, run by Brooke Hecht, and its vision really is to connect people through story, right, to the new story of the natural world and how it fuels us. They're very dedicated to culturally diverse stories and very innovative in how they think about nature writing. You can check them out at humansandnature.org/wildness is where our book is. And in that, you'll find 9 films that our own Jack Lucido here from Western and Gavin Van Horn and I made based on chapters from Wildness. Or if you just go to humansandnature.org, you find all sorts of things, including a question series that includes the beginning essays of my the next book I'm co-editing with folks from the Center for Humans and Nature, Brooke Hecht and Kate Cummings. And I'll just let you know the title of that next book is the question, what kind of ancestor do you want to be? And so if people are intrigued by that, they can go on humansandnature.org and go on the question series and find the beginning essays of that.
All right. Well, I'm already getting out my calendar to have you back to talk about that book.
Spring 2019, man.
All right. John, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Think Radio is supported by the Gunnison Country Times, Gunnison, Colorado's locally owned hometown newspaper.
Think Radio is a production of Alan Wartes Media. The show's associate producer is Kat Seibert. Music by Issa Forrest. You've been listening to Think Radio on KWSB-FM 91.1 in Gunnison, Colorado, from the campus of Western State Colorado University. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Think Radio.